Russia's war on Ukraine has done more than just redraw the battle lines in Europe. It's fundamentally altered Moscow's relationships, not just with the West, but with its erstwhile allies and satellite states, countries that Russia should be able to rely on, that Moscow should be able to rely on, that the Kremlin should be able to rely on, and it can't. And it's destroying itself. As the war grinds on with no clear end in sight, cracks in Russia's influence are emerging across the former Soviet sphere, exemplified by rising tensions first in Armenia, then in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, even in Central Asia and the South Caucasus, regions long seen as Moscow's backyard. The questions being quietly asked are, well, just one question is being quietly asked: what is the point of Putin's war? In the South Caucasus, Armenia's discontent with Moscow has long been palpable. Following Azerbaijan's aggressive moves in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia was left fuming at Russia's ineffectual peacekeepers, whose authority had been steadily eroded and whose value was tested and found wanting. Armenia lost Nagorno-Karabakh, and Nagorno-Karabakh's former prime minister is now in a jail in Armenia. Mr. Vardanyan, someone I know, and Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's overtures to the West underscore that deepening rift between Moscow and Armenia. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan's anger has escalated now after the crash of its plane near Grozny, widely believed to have been struck by Russian air defences. It was only a matter of time before Russia either has to come up with a plausible denial or with an admission. But this debacle, whether anything will be believed now, because Russia was only too quick and too keen to say, bird problem, which rather gives the lie away, doesn't it? It rather proves the point. It was ready with the excuse before anybody even looked at the crash site. This debacle has not only strained bilateral ties, but has also forced regional actors like Kazakhstan into an uneasy balancing act as they try to navigate the growing unpredictability of their once dominant neighbour. Kazakhstan in particular has grown increasingly assertive in distancing itself from Moscow. President Tokayev has publicly rejected Russian claims over parts of Ukraine early in the war, and Kazakhstan has since tightened its neutrality, declining to recognise Russian-annexed territories. Meanwhile, Kazakhstan's trade routes and economic ties have been quietly pivoting towards China and Europe, further eroding Russia's grip on the region. Russia's isolation from the West has been stark and deliberate. European nations, bolstered by US LNG e-ports, have weaned themselves off Russian gas, a shift symbolised by Ukraine's first direct purchase of US liquefied natural gas via Greece, a historic first step towards energy independence. As Europe tightens sanctions and NATO expands, in consequence of Russia's invasion, Russia finds itself encircled not just militarily, but economically, with its ability to project power increasingly curtailed because of Putin's stupidity, and Putin's aggression, and Putin's acquisitive desire, his greed. And domestically, Putin's war is also unravelling his grand vision of a resurgent Russia, a Novorussia. His relentless imperialism has alienated ethnic minorities within the Russian Federation, stoked nationalist tensions, and undermined the fragile multicultural balance that underpins the area, the confederation of countries. Simultaneously, the loss of economic opportunities coupled with mounting casualties has begun to erode the Kremlin's soft power both at home and abroad. Russia's evident missteps in Ukraine have inadvertently catalysed the creation of a cordon sanitaire of anti-Russian states, from Finland and Sweden joining NATO to Central Asia's pivot away from Moscow. Putin's belligerence has done more to isolate Russia than Western policymakers ever could. His obsession with extinguishing Ukrainian statehood has left him blind to the shifting realities. The very nations he seeks to dominate are finding strength in turning away from Moscow. Yet for all this isolation, Putin has managed to maintain an image of resilience domestically. How? Because of propaganda, because of censorship, because of repressive laws. Propaganda continues to shield the Russian public from the reality of the war's failures, spinning tales of progress and glory and defense. But this illusion cannot endure indefinitely. Not when people have access to outside media through VPRs, and as sanctions bite, war fatigue spreads, and regional allies grow more disillusioned. The question is not if Russia will face the consequences of its isolation, but when. It's not just butter which is a problem in Russia and across Russia. It's truth, which is also locked away. Russia's growing isolation, politically, economically, and diplomatically, is not just a reflection of the West's response, but also of the diminishing patience of its own allies and its own people. Yes, nobody in Russia wants to speak out because they know the consequences. The consequences will be prison or being sent to the meat grinder in Ukraine. No one speaks out. Students remain silent. But that isolation has a breaking point. It's not just a reflection of the West's response, but also of the Russian response itself, the wider Slavic response. The war in Ukraine has proven to be a self-inflicted wound, alienating friends, hardening enemies, weakening Moscow's influence across the globe. You only have to look at Syria. Until Putin confronts the reality of his diminished power, until Putin, if he's still alive, emerges from the fridge, emerges from his bunker, and looks dispassionately at what he has created, or until those people who are puppeteering his doppelgangers look at what the menace of Putin, of what Putin's former stupidity did, if he's dead. I mean, again, I come back to the same thing that I've been saying again and again. Putin is like Schrodinger's cat. He's both alive and dead at the moment, because nobody really sees him. Because those appearances are not Putin. Those appearances are the doppelgangers. Very well rehearsed, very well scripted, even capable of responding to Steve Rosenberg. But doppelgangers nevertheless. We don't see Putin. We don't see the real Putin. He is as dead. Whether he is actually effectively dead or whether he is metaphorically dead, he is no longer alive. He is like the parrot in Monty Python. And it doesn't matter how he's propped up on his perch. He is an image of mortality, an image of putrefaction, a putrefied Putin. Until Putin confronts the reality of his waning power, Russia's descent into deeper isolation can only continue, leaving a once mighty empire, leaving a once mighty and highly respected country. I have great fondness and great respect for Russia. I have no respect for Putin and his cronies, none at all. And I will pillory them and mock them as much as I possibly can, because that I think is my job. My job is to giggle at this image of power which Putin manifests from the Smeg fridge. That is what he is worth, as icicles drip from his nose. Well, I don't think they drip from his nose. He's been in the fridge for so long that it's like stalactites. They're probably 3 feet long now, and this is a country which has been set adrift, not by Peter the Great, who knew how to steer the ship of state. It has been set adrift by a madman's folly, by a madman's greed, by a madman's obsession with this Novorussia absurdity, by an attempt to set back the clock. If he wants to play games with Back to the Future, then he needs a time machine, and the time machine is not a Smeg fridge. He is wrong. And the Smeg fridge is not a TARDIS. He is wrong. The Smeg fridge is a coffin in all but name.